A maze appears overnight, and people enter it, but never come out. The night the maze appeared, the air in the town felt wrong. Not just cold or damp as winter nights often were, but oppressive, like the world itself had leaned in too close, whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. I was sitting by the window in my bedroom when I first saw it, a dark mass rising where the park's fountain had always stood. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as I leaned closer, I saw the faint glimmer of moonlight catching on the sharp edges of hedges far too tall to have grown overnight. A knock rattled my bedroom door, and then Clara, my best friend since childhood, burst in, her breath clouding the air. "Have you seen it?" she asked, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. I nodded, pulling on my jacket. "What is it?" "Everyone's calling it the maze," Clara said, grabbing my wrist and dragging me outside. "Come on, you've got to see it up close." The streets were deserted, but not in the comforting way they usually were at this hour. Street lights buzzed faintly, casting harsh pools of light that felt unnatural, sterile. Clara's footsteps echoed against the buildings, and I hurried to keep up, the chill biting at my skin. When we reached the square, a crowd had already gathered. People stood in small groups, their whispers hushed as they pointed at the towering structure. The maze loomed there, its dark hedges twisting upward into the night, blotting out the stars. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, so black it seemed to drink in the light, its edges faintly shimmering as though it were alive. "That wasn't here yesterday," someone murmured. "It wasn't here this afternoon," replied another voice. A gasp rippled through the crowd as someone stepped forward, a man I recognized as Mr. Jansen, who owned the hardware store. He had that glassy-eyed look people get when they're curious enough to override their better judgment. "Wait," a woman called. "Don't." But Jansen was already gone, swallowed by the entrance, his silhouette vanishing into the inky darkness. The crowd waited, holding its collective breath. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He didn't come back. A deep, unsettling silence followed, broken only when a teenager, the mayor's son, Will, ran off towards City Hall to get help. I wanted to leave. I could feel the maze staring at me, even without eyes. But Clara stayed rooted in place, and I didn't want to leave her alone. It was Clara who noticed the note first. Pinned to the lamppost beside the entrance was a scrap of old yellowed paper, fluttering slightly in the still air. She plucked it free and read it aloud. "Enter, and know your truth." The crowd murmured uneasily. Clara's grip on the note tightened, her knuckles pale. "It's like it's calling us," she whispered. I didn't reply. By the time Clara convinced me to go with her, most of the crowd had dispersed. Only a few lingered, their faces drawn with curiosity or fear. The mayor's rescue team hadn't returned, and neither had Mr. Jansen. Yet something about the maze tugged at me, a faint pull at the edges of my mind, a whispering voice I couldn't quite make out, but desperately wanted to understand. "We'll just go in a little," Clara said, though her voice was too steady, too rehearsed. "Just to look." I wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. We stepped across the threshold together, the air inside immediately colder, heavier. The entrance closed behind us, the tall walls of the maze wrapping around like a vice. I reached for Clara's hand, but she had already moved ahead, her flashlight slicing through the thick darkness. The walls of the maze weren't hedges exactly, not like the ones you'd see in a garden. These brambles were sharp, black, and alive with a faint pulse, like veins pumping something vile through them. I tried not to touch them as I followed Clara deeper into the twisting corridors. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. I paused, straining my ears. At first, I thought it was just the sound of our breathing, but then I caught it. A faint murmuring, like voices layered on top of one another. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. "It's coming from over there," Clara said, pointing toward a narrow path branching off to the left. "No," I said quickly, grabbing her arm. "We shouldn't." She turned to me, her eyes wide and shining in the dim light. "What if someone's hurt? It could be Mr. Jansen." I didn't argue. I couldn't. Her determination was infectious, and part of me, a part I hated, wanted to know where the voices were leading us. The path narrowed as we moved, the walls closing in until I could feel the brambles scraping my sleeves. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could make out fragments now. "Turn back. Help. Stay." Then the path opened into a small clearing. At its center lay a crumpled scarf, bright red against the dark ground. "It's Tara's," Clara whispered, picking it up. "Tara was supposed to be at home," I said, my voice trembling. Clara didn't answer. She was staring at the opposite side of the clearing, where another path twisted into the darkness. And that's when we heard it, a voice, clear and soft, drifting from the new path. "Clara!" It was Tara's voice. Without hesitation, Clara bolted toward the sound, the scarf slipping from her hands. "Clara, wait!" I shouted, but she was already gone, swallowed by the maze. I stood alone in the clearing, Clara's name echoing down the path she'd taken. My pulse hammered in my ears as I debated whether to follow. The maze seemed to shift around me, the air growing heavier with every second. I bent to pick up Tara's scarf, but as my fingers brushed it, I heard another voice, a whisper right behind me. "Alex." I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my grip, but no one was there. My breath clouded in the freezing air as I scanned the walls of brambles. The shadows between the thorns seemed to writhe, alive with something unseen. Then the whisper came again, softer this time, almost tender. "Don't leave me." It was my mother's voice. The weight of it hit me like a punch to the chest. My mother had been gone for years, taken by a sickness that left me hollowed out and aching. Hearing her voice now, here, in this impossible place, felt like a cruel trick. "No," I muttered, backing away. "You're not real." The maze didn't care. The whisper grew louder, drawing me down a path I hadn't noticed before. Against every shred of common sense, I followed it. The walls closed in tighter as I moved, the thorns brushing my shoulders and snagging my clothes. The air reeked of damp earth and decay. As I turned a corner, I saw her, or something that looked like her. My mother stood at the end of the path, her back to me. Her hair was just as I remembered, falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She wore the pale blue dress she'd always loved, the one she was buried in. "Mom." My voice cracked, the word catching in my throat. She didn't turn, but her voice came again, soft and pleading. "Alex, I've missed you." I took a step closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet betrayed me. "You can't be here," I whispered. She turned then, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her face was wrong, too pale, too smooth, her eyes empty hollows. She smiled, and it was the smile of something pretending to be human. "I need you to stay," she said, her voice layered with something deeper, darker. I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground as the maze's whispers grew louder, filling my head with disjointed pleas and half-formed promises. The thing wearing my mother's face stepped closer, its head tilting unnaturally as it reached out a hand. "You belong here," it said. "No!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet and running blindly. The maze seemed to twist and shift around me, the walls rippling as though alive. I didn't look back, couldn't look back, even as the whispers turned into a roar. When I finally stopped running, my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold, hard ground. My flashlight flickered weakly, the battery dying, leaving me in near total darkness. My breaths came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with fear. The maze had grown quiet again, the whispers receding into a low, almost imperceptible hum. I felt as though I had been swallowed whole, lost in a place that defied all logic. There was no way to tell how far I'd gone or where I was. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. Clara needed me. Tara might still be alive, and if the maze had its way, I'd join them, vanishing into its endless corridors. I pulled myself to my feet, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The beam barely penetrated the suffocating dark, but it was enough to reveal a strange symbol etched into the ground at my feet. It was circular, with jagged lines radiating outward like the legs of a spider. "What is this place?" I whispered to no one. The maze answered. The walls groaned, shifting in the darkness as if they'd heard my question. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a cold, pale glow seeping through the cracks in the brambles. I didn't want to move toward it, but my feet betrayed me again, drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. As I approached, the walls widened into another clearing, this one far larger than the last. At the center stood a grotesque altar, its surface covered in symbols like the one I'd seen earlier. The light emanated from the altar itself, pulsing faintly like a dying star. Around it were objects, things that didn't belong here. A pair of cracked glasses, a scarf, a silver bracelet, Tara's bracelet. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, the oppressive air pressing down on me like a physical weight. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices pleading, laughing, crying. "Help us. Join us. Stay." The light from the altar flared, and I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving within the walls of the maze. They were human once. I could feel it in the way they reached for me, their hands clawing at the edges of the clearing. "You can't leave," one of them whispered, its voice soft but filled with despair. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The altar's light dimmed, and for a moment, the shadows stopped. Then the maze spoke again, not in whispers, but in a single deafening roar. "Everything." The walls trembled, the brambles quivering like the limbs of some great beast. The shadows surged forward, their forms melting into the ground, into the air, into me. I turned and ran again, the maze's laughter echoing in my ears. The maze's laughter trailed me as I stumbled through the twisting corridors, each turn narrowing the space until I could feel the thorns brushing against my shoulders. My legs ached, my breath came in sharp gasps, but I couldn't stop. Behind me, the air rippled with movement, shadows flowing like water, faster than my feet could carry me. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices no longer fragmented. "Stay. Belong. Give yourself." "No," I screamed, slamming my shoulder against a sudden fork in the path. The impact sent me sprawling onto the ground, my flashlight tumbling from my grasp. Darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment, all I could hear was the thudding of my heart. When I scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, its beam flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The maze seemed to lean closer, its thorned brambles pulsing faintly as though feeding on my fear. A path appeared ahead, a narrow corridor bathed in faint, silvery light. The glow was different from the altar's cold, lifeless luminescence. It felt real. Hope flickered in my chest, fragile but insistent. "This has to be the way out," I muttered, forcing my legs to move. I ran, the walls blurring around me as the light grew brighter. The whispers were still there, still calling, but they sounded distant now, their pull weakening. The silver light grew stronger, and I felt the crisp night air brush my skin. Then I saw it, a break in the maze, an archway of twisted branches framing the world beyond. The stars shone above, and the faint outline of the town's lampposts flickered in the distance. Freedom. I surged forward, my feet pounding against the ground. The exit was so close I could feel it, the oppressive weight of the maze lifting with every step. But just as I reached the threshold, a cold, clawed hand clamped down on my wrist. I screamed, twisting around to see one of the shadows, its form shifting like smoke. Its face was a void, a hollow absence that seemed to drain the light from my surroundings. It didn't speak, but its grip tightened, pulling me back into the maze. No, let me go. I thrashed against it, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. It hit the ground with a clatter, its beam illuminating the other shadows closing in. Their forms writhed, human but wrong, faces stretched and distorted, limbs bent at impossible angles. The whispers returned, louder now, a deafening roar that filled my head. You cannot leave. You belong here. You are ours. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I reached for the flashlight, gripping it like a weapon. I swung wildly, the beam slicing through the shadow holding me. It recoiled, hissing, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I bolted for the exit, leaping through the archway and collapsing onto the cold, hard ground outside. The air was sharp and clean, the oppressive weight of the maze gone in an instant. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling. Behind me the maze loomed silently, its dark walls unmoving. The whispers had ceased, replaced by the quiet hum of the town in the distance. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady. My flashlight flickered weakly in my hand as I turned to look at the maze one last time. It was smaller now, less imposing, as though it had never been the monstrous labyrinth I'd fought to escape. The entrance was still there, dark and yawning, but it no longer seemed to beckon. Then I noticed it, a single object lying just outside the threshold. Tara's scarf. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It felt warm, impossibly so, as though it had been held in someone's hands only moments ago. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, drifting from deep within the maze. We are not done. I staggered back, clutching the scarf to my chest. The maze didn't move, but the ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I turned and ran, leaving the square behind. The next morning, when I returned with the mayor and half the town, the maze was gone. Only a barren patch of earth remained, its edges charred as though scorched by fire. But I could still feel it, the faint tug at the edge of my mind, the echo of whispers just beyond hearing. The maze wasn't finished with me. It never would be.